Well, good morning, everyone. Please turn your Bibles to Matthew 5. We are looking at the second of 6 illustrations that Jesus gives in his Sermon on the Mount to help us understand what true righteousness is really about. That God is more concerned with the attitudes and the intents of our hearts and not simply with our actions and behaviors. 2 weeks ago, we looked at the first illustration, which was about murder and anger. And Jesus showed us that the motive for murder condemns us as much as the act. If murder is a capital crime, then anger which leads to murder ought to have its day in court too. If we cure anger, murder wouldn't be a problem. The second illustration which we will be looking at this morning is about adultery and lust. Here again, Jesus points us to the real issue, which is the lust in our hearts. And as awkward as it may be to talk about lust and sex in church, we are going to talk about lust and sex in church this morning. So let's begin by reading today's text taken from Matthew chapter 5, verse 27 to 30. You have heard that it was said, "Do not commit adultery." But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. A young college student perhaps spoke for many in our generation when he said, Look, just because some old man spent a night on the mountain and came down and said, "You shall not commit adultery," why should I let that spoil my fun? Why indeed? When Hugh Hefner first published Playboy magazine in the 1950s, it created a huge scandal. Growing up as a kid in the 1960s and 70s, the only dirty thing I saw was pigs rolling around in the mud. But times have changed. Our society has not only promoted Hefner's Playboy's narrative, it has also made it easily accessible to anyone at the click of a button. A narrative that says all sex is just good, clean fun, and people should be able to enjoy sex whenever, wherever, and with whoever and whatsoever they wanted. Anyone objecting to this narrative received the dreaded label Puritan, as someone who lived to take the joy out of life. Adultery? Well, as long as it is done by consenting adults, uh, it isn't wrong. It is merely a Puritan hang-up. Our sexual proclivity is nobody's business, and it is certainly nothing to be ashamed of. Well, this narrative, however, did not originate from Hefner, nor is it a product of the 20th century. It's been around ever since Adam and Eve brought sin into the world by eating the forbidden fruit. It was there in the days of Noah, was there in the degenerate cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and even in Jesus' day, the sexual attitudes and behaviors of ancient Rome and Greece would make us blush even by today's standards. They had gods devoted to it, festivals to participate in, and local economies that surrounded it. Sex wasn't something to be ashamed of or to be hidden from public view. Rather, it is something to rejoice in. There is some measure of truth in this narrative, like all false narratives do. Sex is not something to be ashamed of. In fact, sexual desire is indeed good, for it was created by God. Sex was his idea, after all. It was his design. God's first command to Adam and Eve was to be fruitful and multiply, which implies sex and lots of it. But Just because it is commanded by God does not mean there are no boundaries. Just because it is natural does not mean it is always right. Just because it feels good does not mean it is always good. Not all sexual desires and expressions are good, and not all of them are bad. To be clear, sex is part of God's plan for us, given to us for two distinct purposes: procreation and pleasure. And He also gave us a safe, secure place to experience those desires, which is within the confines of a committed marriage relationship. Inside the confines of a committed marriage relationship, sex has tremendous benefits, but outside the confines of a committed marriage relationships, sex can be devastating and sex can be dangerous. So many lives and so many families lie in ruins today in our society because so many people have completely disregarded God's design and God's plan for human sexuality. So many people today are desperate for love, but they are looking for love in all the wrong places and in all the wrong ways. A case in point, I came across a personal ad in a newspaper that says, single white female, 6 male companionship. Ethnicity, not important. I am a very good looking girl. I love to play, love long walks, camping, fishing, cozy nights, lying on a sofa. Candlelight dinners will have me eating out of your hand, rub me the right way and watch me respond. I will be at the front door when you come home from work every day, wearing only what nature gave me. Kiss me and I'm yours. Call, and there's a phone number listed there, which I'm not going to read out. It says, call and ask for Daisy. Well, get this, 15,000 men responded to that ad. 15,000, only to reach an animal shelter where a 9-week-old white Labradoodle retriever lives. Well, if you are looking for love in all the wrong places, you are in the right place today. Jesus knew about the power of human sexuality, how it can destroy life or enhance life. And he spoke to the issue in the Sermon on the Mount. And he turns to the 7th of the 10 commandments, do not commit adultery, to set the context of his teachings. At first glance, it seems that Jesus is saying that if you have sexual desires, you are going to hell. But that's a great misunderstanding. He begins by saying, you have heard that it was said, do not commit adultery. Let me just pause here and for a minute and give us a little historical background to enrich our understanding to what Jesus might be getting at here. Adultery, as we understand it, is defined as sexual relations between a married person and a person who is not their spouse. The difference between our day and Jesus' day is that adultery was applied almost exclusively to women. That is, sexual relations of a married woman with any man other than her husband. The extramarital relations of a married man is not technically adultery in the Jewish law. Married men could have sex with any unmarried woman as long as she is not engaged to any other man. And so the men were getting it. But a woman was allowed to have sex only with her husband. So it seems a little bit one-sided, but that was how the law was applied. Perhaps that's why only the woman who was caught in the act of adultery and brought before Jesus was deemed guilty of breaking the law. The story in John's Gospel chapter 8. Now, Jesus, on the other hand, did not allow for such a restricted view of the law. He said instead, but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Again, Jesus did not contradict the Old Testament law. He did not set it aside. Adultery is still forbidden. He is simply opposing the restricted teaching of the Pharisees, and he does so at two levels. First, he says, anyone, which means men and not just women. Men and women, married or unmarried, can commit adultery. And since those who were listening to him that day were mostly men, this must have been quite unsettling to many of them, because that's not what they were taught. That's not what their culture was practicing. Second, he says adultery is not just an act. It has to do with the heart. And we have to take responsibility for it. Anyone who looks at the woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. When Jesus talks about looking at the woman lustfully, he isn't simply talking about sexual desire. That was given to us by God and portrayed in the Bible as a good gift. Admittedly, the gift is often labeled handle with care, but sexual desire comes from God, as we have said earlier. By the word lust, Jesus is not referring to sexual desire or the normal attraction between men and women. The word he used is the same word from Greek that is sometimes translated as coveting. It is the desire that focuses on a woman or man. Yes, women lust too. Think Potiphar's wife. It is the desire that focuses on another person with a view of possessing them or having an immoral relationship with them. It is a look with a purpose. To put it in another way, it is, I would if I could. The stress is in its purpose. Anyone who purposes in his heart to have an illicit relationship with another has already committed adultery in God's eye. That Jesus chose this word coveting is worth noting, because it seems Jesus is here connecting the 7th command regarding adultery with the 10th command regarding coveting. The 10 commandments first appear in the Bible in Exodus 20. And the 10th commandment says this: you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his manservant or maidservant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Interestingly, when the command is repeated again in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 21, the order of the items is slightly different. Wife appears before house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. Perhaps a result of 40 years of wandering in the desert, desires change, priorities change, who knows? Anyway, coveting has got more people into more troubles than probably any other sin. You can even make the case that it is where all the other sins start. Pick a sin, any sin. When you think about it, almost across the board, the driving motivation behind disobeying any of God's command is going to begin with the words, I want. I want. When we covet, we give in to a toxic, selfish mindset that often leads to the downward path of sin and death. A classic example of this is David's adulterous affair with Bathsheba. It begins with a look, and then lust, then sex. She's pregnant. He moves on to lies, deception, treachery, finally murder. Let me clarify something. There's nothing wrong with wanting some things, but there is something wrong with obsessing over the things you want. There's an important difference between wanting a wife like your neighbor's and wanting your neighbor's wife. Big difference. And when our wants become our gods, we break the Ten Commandments and consequently the very first command along with it. When we put our wants and selfishness ahead of God, in this case our sexual desires, it becomes an idolatry. Paul made this connection in his letter to the church in Ephesus. Ephesians 5:5 says this, "For you may be sure of this, that everyone who is sexually immoral or impure, or who is covetous, that is an idolater." Now, watch this. He says everyone who is sexually immoral or impure, or who is covetous, that person is an idolater, and he has no inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. This is serious stuff. That lustful look, that lustful thought, it is not harmless. Just ask David. Our vivid imagination, which is one of the many ways that makes us different from animals, is a very precious gift from God. None of the world's art or man's noblest achievement would ever have been made possible without his imagination. But all God's gift needs to be used responsibly, and all God's gift can be readily abused and degraded. And that's certainly true of our imagination. So serious is this issue of lust that Jesus goes on and gives us a rather drastic solution to it. He says, if your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Now, obviously, Jesus is not speaking literally here. He's speaking hyperbolically. He's employing a figure of speech that uses exaggeration to make his point. And what is his point? Because lust is such a corrupting, damaging force, you ought to deal with it drastically. Now, to take Jesus' words about mutilation literally can be almost humorous. Suppose I'm having a struggle with lust. I poke my right eye out, but there's no evidence that shows that one-eyed people are less lustful than two-eyed people. I chop off my right hand. Again, no studies can verify that one-handed people are less lustful than two-handed people. There's a commonly held notion that sin resides in the offending part of the body, and perhaps that's why some cultures cut off the hand of a thief. They reason, cut off the sinful part of the sin, cut off the sinful part, and the sin will be gone. So, if your right eye causes you to sin, cut it out. But that's not what Jesus is saying. And you and I know better. I could gouge out my other left eye even, cut off both my arms and my legs, but sexual fantasies will still play on in the cinema of my mind. The problem isn't the body parts. The lust is in our hearts, the imaginations, the fantasizing, the obsessing. Those are harder to get rid of. And lust is not only directed towards sex. Oftentimes it's directed towards other things like money, power, fame, recognition. The question we have to deal with is, how are we going to deal with it? And what Jesus is telling us here is, look, you have to be drastic here. Don't play with lust. Don't toy with it. Whatever feeds a sinful imagination must be cut off. Whatever leads you down that path, get rid of it. If you have to go to extreme measures, take it. Be ruthless with your sin. because your life, your eternity is at stake here. This week I came across Dietrich Bonhoeffer's pastoral advice about lust. He says this: adherence to Jesus allows no free rein to desire unless it is accompanied by love. Instead of trusting to the unseen, we prefer the tangible fruits of desire, and so we fall from the path of discipleship and lose touch with Jesus. Lust is impure because it is unbelief, and therefore it is to be shunned. No sacrifice is too great if it enables us to conquer a lust which cuts us off from Jesus. When you have made your eye the instrument of impurity, you cannot see God with it. Blessed are the pure in heart, said Jesus, for they will see God. Many of you have probably heard of the children's Sunday school song, "Be careful, little eyes, what you see. Be careful, little eyes, what you see. For the Father up above is looking down in love. So be careful, little eyes, what you see. Be careful, little ears, what you hear. Be careful, little hands, what you do. Be careful, little feet, where you go." Great advice, not just for little kids, but what's even greater? For the Father up above is looking down in love. Love. Ultimately, it is the love of the Father that will enable us to overcome the lust that is in our hearts. G.K. Chesterton, referred to by many as the Prince of Paradox, once wrote that every man who knocks on the door of a brothel is looking for God. That statement has always reminded me of Jesus' conversation with the Samaritan woman at the well, John's Gospel chapter 4. She was looking for love in all the wrong places. You could say she was thirsty. She was thirsty for love, thirsty for intimacy, thirsty for affirmation. And she was looking for it in men. Jesus did not condemn her thirst. Instead, he used her thirst for love to introduce her to living waters. He said, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks the water I give him will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." And now she has a decision to make. Continue to look to men to quench her thirst, or to living water, the one who could ultimately fully satisfy her deepest longings. This is the same decision you and I have to make each time we come to a well. What do I want more? What do I desire more? Jesus does not forbid his disciples to look at anything, but he bids them to look at him. If they do that, he knows that their gaze will always be pure, even when they look upon a woman. Would you bow your heads and pray with me? Father, thank you for the song that reminds us that you are always looking down at us in love. Thank you that your love for us is not determined by who we are or what we can do in your kingdom, or by how many times we have or have not messed up in our lives. Not at all. Father, give us the courage to see lust for what it is, an idolatry, a false narrative, a short-lived feeling of pleasure that ultimately harms us and the people around us. That the boundaries that you have set for us are there not because you want to keep us from having fun, but to keep us from having harm. Father, forgive us for the times we have strayed, times we have given to temptations. Please fill our minds with your thoughts and our hearts with your desires, and help us to see Jesus, only Jesus. We pray this in his name. Amen.